Everyone. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here at CSIS. And it's my pleasure to be co-hosting on behalf of CSIS, along with the Army War College, this session on deterrence in the 21st century. The idea behind this particular panel is that, as we've seen from areas as cross-cutting as China, Russia, Iran, of course, IS and others, many opponents of the United States or potential opponents are forming themselves up in ways that are unlike what we have seen, at least in the past 30 years or so. They are challenging the United States in areas as diverse as, of course, nuclear competition, conventional cyberspace, paramilitary, but then also economic challenges, cyber, as I said before, and energy challenges. So the question here is, if we seem to be succeeding at the high end of conflict, if deterrence is holding, what then is happening that is creating all these other tensions at lower levels? Why is it that certain adversaries or potential adversaries feel that they can challenge the United States' interests in these other ways? To help us think through how that deterrence challenge set is or isn't changing is this great set of panelists that we have here today. Starting all the way to my right, we have Robert Kagan, who is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. He also serves as a member of the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board and is co-chairman of the Bipartisan Working Group on Egypt. He writes routinely for the Washington Post and is a contributing editor at the New Republic and has served in the State Department from 1984 to 1988 as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff and a principal speechwriter for Secretary of State George Shultz. We also have sitting to his left and my right, Nate Freier, who is my partner in crime here with the Army War College, an associate professor of national security studies at Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. Nate came to SSI after 5 years here at CSIS, where he was a senior fellow in the International Security Program. He joined CSIS in 2008 after completing a 20-year career in the U.S. Army, where he was involved in the development of numerous strategy documents and strategic planning efforts. Let's see, he's also served, I should add, twice in senior-level military positions in Iraq. To my left is Mike Green. Dr. Mike Green is Senior Vice President for Asia and the Japan Chair at CSIS. He's an associate professor at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and his research focuses on Asian regional architecture, Japanese politics, U.S. foreign policy, the Korean Peninsula. I could go on, but I will stop in many areas. He also served on the National Security Staff in 2001 to 2004. And he has served from 2004 to 2005 as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia. And then on the far left here, we have Lisa Samp, who is a fellow in the International Security Program, focusing on European security and looking extensively at issues of Russia challenges. Prior to joining CSIS, Ms. Samp served on the National Security Council staff as well. As a director for NATO and European Strategic Affairs from 2014 to 2015. She has also served as Chief of Staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and as a NATO Policy Advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So what we're going to do here is we're going to begin with Robert, and then we will move to Mike, Lisa, and Nate will bat clean up. And each presenter is going to talk a little bit about their respective perspectives on this. We're going to start with the broadest perspective of what exactly might be going on here. We're going to talk a little about what is happening with China, what is happening with Russia, and then end with Nate, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So without further ado, over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Kath, and thank you all for coming on this rainy day. I guess it's better to be in here than out there. I am going to take a broad historical perspective and look a lot at the 20th century and the two sort of catastrophic breakdowns of deterrence that led to both World War I and World War II. And one reason this is, I mean, it's always relevant, but it's particularly relevant today, I think, because what's happening in the world is pretty clearly a return to great power competition. We've got sort of a classic, it's not a multipolar world. The United States is still dominant, but we definitely have aspiring great powers. China undoubtedly is an aspiring regional power, but Russia, which people tend to write off because it's collapsing allegedly, and the only thing I would say about that is Russia's been collapsing for 400 years, but its ability to exert influence in its region, which is a vast region, and particularly in Europe, has always been great, whether it's collapsing or not. And it certainly is great today. And I think that if you don't want to call Russia a rising power, you certainly can call it a dissatisfied power. It's not happy with the Cold War settlement in the same way that Germany was not happy with the Treaty of Versailles. It's seeking revision of that settlement in the same way that Germany sought revision of the Versailles Treaty, and which Japan sought revision of the order that it entered when it became a great power at the end of the 19th century. I think the fact that we are seeing them operating in, I guess, what is called gray areas as opposed to overt intervention, although in the case of Russia we have seen some of that, that's merely a function of the fact that, as Kath says, at the high end deterrence is working, but it doesn't mean that they're doing anything different than great powers have ever done. And the question is how long does that high-end deterrence work? Because as soon as they feel that it's not going to work, they will move on to the next stage. I mean, if you see them operating at a low level, it's because they're afraid to operate at a high level. Whether they continue to be afraid is the key question. So just a few lessons, I would say. History is useful, although historians frequently get the history wrong, in which case it's not useful. But for good historians, the one thing that's useful about it is you can see the decision-making processes of governments in the documents that emerge afterwards. And you could see the choices that they faced. And we have to, even though we can't see what the Chinese government or the Russian government is really thinking, we can see how governments like them or in a similar situation to them felt before and maybe have some general understanding about how best to influence their behavior. So just the lesson of World War I is not what, unfortunately, you would have read if you read the latest books about World War I, which I think the latest one is called Sleepwalking, the Sleepwalkers. The notion that everybody stumbled in, the stumbling into war thesis, which is very prevalent, which Graham Allison loves, was pretty much destroyed 25 years ago. The consensus was what everybody thought was the case, which is that Germany basically started the war. But the historians have worked around that. But what we can say about that war, and it's relevant to our time, is if Kaiser Wilhelm had known for certain that Britain was going to enter the war and with sufficient force to prevent the Schlieffen Plan from unfolding, he would not have gone to war. It was because he entertained real doubts and in fact hoped against hope that the British would not enter the war that he took the big risk of unleashing this conflict, which ultimately led to Germany's destruction. The lesson, I think, is very clear for us today. When you have a sort of commitment to others, in the case of our case, we have alliances. Britain had also formed a kind of alliance with France, but it hadn't really made a military commitment to it. But when you have those kinds of commitments, the worst thing you can possibly do if you're trying to stir up the possibility of war is to create doubt in the mind of the potential of the dissatisfied power as to whether you really will come and defend them. The trap there is that, of course, you will ultimately have to come to defend them in the same way that Britain ultimately did. So you will have led yourself into this conflict by not making it extremely clear that you will come in. We have this concept out there in Asia that in our policy in Asia, something called strategic ambiguity, which relates to Taiwan, but I'm afraid in some respects may be relating to the whole region. And ambiguity is the recipe for conflict. The lessons you can learn in the lead up to World War II, one of them has to do with this very complicated and difficult phenomenon that Nate and I were talking about before we got here, which is in order to prevent the conflict that's going to come eventually, you have to take action when the threat is not yet immediately apparent. And that is so hard to do that that's why history is a history of repeated failures of deterrence. So the two examples in the two different theaters. The turning point, in my view, in the US-Japan relationship, I hesitate to talk about Japan with Mike here, but he'll have to bear with me and he can correct me later. The turning point was not in 1931 and with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and everything that followed after that. In my view, the turning point came in 1921 and 22, when the Japanese at that time were petrified of this enormous naval buildup that Wilson inaugurated during World War I. And as a result, basically, were willing to forego plans that they had, which they probably couldn't even afford, but which they were going forward with their Navy, in order to get an agreement with the United States to limit naval forces. And that was the Washington Naval Agreement. Following the Washington Naval Agreement, Japan abided by the agreement, and the United States did not abide by the agreement in the following sense. The United States did not build up to the levels necessary that were permitted by the treaty, while Japan did. And so gradually, the naval balance in the Western Pacific began to shift in such a way as to be increasingly either equal or maybe even slightly favoring the Japanese. The lesson there is, and then what happens in the 1930s is when the United States starts to worry about growing Japanese power, then the United States starts gradually or even hurriedly trying to build up its Navy, and that sent the Japanese into a panic, which led them to preemptively act before the United States could build up the capacity to defeat them. And the lesson there is, never fall behind. In fact, never allow the rising or dissatisfied power to obtain equality or even, or worse, superiority, which would allow them to think that they can pull it off now. Because our response then, as things get risky again, might be the buildup. That creates the classic, the classic sequence that, at least historically, has led to conflict. But what that means is the decision that was taken in 1922 when Japan looked quite anodyne. It was a fairly democratic government. It was not aggressive. The military had not taken over. In fact, they'd been sort of suppressed. Decisions made at a time of calm and relative security wound up undermining that security a decade hence. And there's a similar story to be told about Weimar Germany, which I know I'm not to go on forever, so I'll pass that. We can, if you want, I can tell you that story then. The other thing, and I'll leave with this thought. Whether you deter or effectively deter or ineffectively deter, not only has an effect on a rising or dissatisfied power calculations in foreign policy, it actually has an effect frequently on domestic issues and the nature of the regime domestically. Because, and this is also apparent in Japan and also in Germany during these sort of 1920s and early 1930s period. Effective deterrence, meaning that it's pretty well known that in those cases the United States would have superiority and would be willing to use its superiority, tends to strengthen forces in other governments that say, we need to moderate our aspirations, we need to pursue a course that basically will sort of integrate us into the system, because challenging the system is too frightening. It's obvious, and they are able to point in their internal arguments, because there's always an internal argument. They're able to point at the enormous power and the great risk of conflict that they would suffer if they took the harder line that some are advocating. So I don't think it's really a paradox, it may seem paradoxical, but a more sort of strong and threatening posture on the part of the status quo power actually in most cases tends to strengthen the forces of moderation in other governments. It also gets people angry, but at the end of the day, their calculation is shaped by the fact that it seems like conflict is too risky. When the deterrence begins to fail, those forces that are arguing for a harder line have a better argument because the risk of following their course seems to be less. And the people who are saying, you can't do this because it doesn't get us into war, lose the argument because the prospect of actually responding by the status quo power has gone down. It seems to be a better risk. That happened in the case of Japan. It happened in the case of Germany. I believe that a similar dynamic is probably at work in China today and would be at work in Russia. So what you see happening now, there are debates in these countries about how far to push. If pushing is successful, it strengthens those who say push more. If pushing is unsuccessful, it strengthens those who say push less. Okay, I think I'm well exceeded my time, but I'll end with that.
Great, that's a great setup. And so, Mike, why don't you carry forward with respect to China? What is it that we're seeing, and why do you think we're seeing it, and what do we do about it?
So I'm not going to say what I thought I was going to say, because I'm glad that Bob raised the interwar years and the example of Japan, because we have seen the play we're seeing with China before, and the closest thing to it is Japan and the US in the 20s and 30s. In a lot of ways, people don't think about, much broader than just the size of the Navy, though that was critical. I think in this town, we are beginning to have a consensus on what's happening in terms of Chinese coercion in maritime Asia. But we didn't for a long time. People overinterpreted the whole problem. It was the Chinese bureaucratic competition between the 5 or 6 maritime services. Xi Jinping was going to fix that, we were told by a lot of China experts, and bring them together in one Coast Guard. He did. Now that Coast Guard is deploying 11,000-ton cutters in the East China Sea. So that wasn't it. It's that Japan or the Philippines were provoking poor little China. That's not it. I think it's pretty clear now. So we had a hard time in this town. When I say we, I don't mean anyone on this stage. We collectively, figuring out what we were seeing with China, a country that has an enormous trading and financial relationship with us, and with whom we need to work on global issues like climate change and so forth. How could they be challenging us when we have so much in common when it comes to these larger transnational challenges? I think part of it is Bob being a notable exception. A lot of people in this town have lost their sense of history and of geography. China's a rising power, no doubt about it. It is different from Russia, the caveats Bob mentioned notwithstanding. Historically, rising powers free ride on the global hegemonic power and then act revisionist, take revisionist behavior in their own neighborhood. We did it in the 19th century. We were free riders on the British, and we basically changed the order in the Western Hemisphere. The Japanese did it in the beginning of the 20th century, allied with the British, but gradually, incrementally, using coercion and other measures, began revising the order in East Asia. The Germans did it under Bismarck in Central Europe, and the Chinese are doing it today. They are free riding on us globally, and they are engaging in revisionist behavior regionally, which is why they have to calibrate, because they don't want to challenge the US global order. They still depend on it. Xi Jinping's maxim, bide your time, hide your strength, has eroded under Xi Jinping, but China still has an enormous stake in the US-China relationship, as do we. And so that combination of free riding globally and revisionist behavior regionally is very hard strategically to deal with if you don't understand geography and history. I think the activity you see in the South China Sea, the coercive measures on the Philippines, on Indonesia, on Malaysia even, on Vietnam, on Japan, these are not just tactical problems, they're not just problems of sea lanes. These go to the heart of whether the post-war order cemented in San Francisco in the 1951 treaty system is still the prevailing order, or whether there's some new order that will be based on a more historic, Sino-centric, tributary state, sort of peaceful development or peaceful rise system, which Chinese scholars, Jen B. Jen and others have said was always benign for the region, much more benign than this Cold War structure the Americans set up. And there's a discourse up to the level of Xi Jinping that portrays this, that China's trying to create a more Asian order, or as Xi Jinping put it, an order by Asians for Asians. So, flashback to the 1920s and 30s, as Japan was in a somewhat similar mode. The Navy and the Marine Corps, because of a lack of resources, innovated. oil replenishment at sea, amphibious operations, created a fleet second to none because they were forced to execute War Plan Orange. They did it in a silo. War Plan Orange was not briefed to the White House between Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was a hedging strategy. The Navy didn't have a shaping strategy. And so we got what Bob described. The Treasury Department, the new Federal Reserve Bank, JP Morgan, they were trying to deepen interdependence with Japan. Thomas Lamont, the president of JP Morgan, gave a speech in LA in 1928 saying, war with Japan, 1928, war with Japan is an impossibility because of the level of financial interdependence. The State Department was hewing to the 1920 agreements and rule of law and saying Japan will only isolate itself in the community of nations. And the State Department and the War and Navy departments were not allowed to do what's called external balancing. So the British in 1937, when Japan attacked, entered the war with China, the British proposed that the US Navy and the Royal Navy send 8 battleships to the region together. And Japanese historians, naval historians have said that would have seriously paused their thinking. But FDR said no, because memories of alliances were bad from the First World War. Okay, break to where we are today. Frequently, the State Department will say China's only isolating itself. Treasury is very focused on, for all the right reasons, our financial interdependence. With the third offset, the military is, focusing on war-winning capabilities to counter the A2AD, and you have this debate in the Navy, which I know Kath loves, about presence versus capability.
Presence versus posture.
Posture, thank you. So we do not yet have a grand strategy that integrates all the instruments. What China is doing is based on a strategic objective, but it's very carefully calibrated, as Bob described it. Tactically, Kath and I have a project where we're looking at these coercion examples and doing detailed case studies. We have a matrix of all the tools that are used for coercion or counter-coercion, military, paramilitary, financial, propaganda. In almost every case we look at, China is ticking every box across the board. Military, but also paramilitary. Coast Guard, paramilitary fishing fleets. Across the board, China's ticking all the boxes. We generally tick the boxes that are under international law, sometimes diplomacy, but our matrix, or our allies' matrix, is a lot sparser. So that's an area to think about, tactically. But I think the tactical response is not as important as the strategic response, which is the lesson of the interwar years, which is why, if you work on Asia, there's a lot of reasons to be confident. We have allies today. We didn't in the 1920s and 30s. We have, relative command of international institutions and leadership. We didn't in the 1920s and 30s. But when you look at the frontrunners' positions on TPP, on how they talk about alliances, the biggest problem in a way we face is our own ability to pull together this grand strategy.
Great. Okay, so Lisa, what's your view of what's happening with Russia and deterrence?
Yeah, so on Russia in general, I think the period we're in today, while not a new Cold War, does represent the most antagonistic and confrontational period in U.S.-Russia relations for perhaps the last 25 to 30 years. And I think its actions do represent a clear and long-term threat to U.S. national security interests, given the challenge it presents to the European security architecture, international rule of law, more broadly. Russia is a nuclear power. It's a near-peer military competitor. It has an increasingly comfortable reliance on the use of force and a natural proximity advantage to NATO's eastern flank. So while the likelihood of a direct military confrontation with Russia remains low, I think the consequences, should it occur, would be astronomically high, which is why having a credible and sustainable deterrence strategy related to Russia is so important. Of course, deterrence, as was mentioned, is measured in the mind of the deterred, and while Putin may be many things, spoiler, instigator, opportunist, I think it's dismissive to call him crazy. His goals are centered on the preservation of power. He uses military adventures abroad to distract from economic failings at home and to protect his spheres of influence. As Bob said, he believes the post-Cold War status quo is not in Russia's favor. And he sees a so-called encirclement by NATO, including enlargement, the missile defense systems in Romania and in Poland as existential threats to Russian security. Ultimately, he would like to see security, economic, and political buffers reestablished against what he views as Western meddling in Russia's backyard, which he thinks could ultimately threaten his regime, Russia's interests, or lead to a kind of color revolution. Moscow is therefore engaged in a broad campaign to introduce instability into the international system and shake up that status quo. Modern Russian military doctrine, also called New Generation Warfare or also hybrid, as more commonly known perhaps, calls for a comprehensive approach to warfare that relies on ambiguity and plausible deniability. This is done in order to confuse and delay traditional Western response options, and he credibly backs up his non-conventional threats with conventional force. We are seeing this strategy in action with the use of little green men in Ukraine, backed by Russian troops just on the other side of the border, snap exercises, reckless brinksmanship along NATO's air, land, and sea borders, and you're probably aware of the most recent incident, which was a couple weeks ago now, related to the USS Donald Cook in the Baltic Sea. Just another example. The Russia A2AD, anti-access area denial threat, is another reason for concern. They have essentially created a virtual wall from the Kola Peninsula in the north all the way down to Latika in the south, which makes the insertion of U.S. forces in the event of an emergency exceedingly dangerous and difficult. Moscow is also increasing its cyber and space-based ISR capabilities and has nearly doubled its ISR satellites since 2014. In total, the Russians are investing about $700 billion in a defense modernization strategy through 2020 that will upgrade about 70% of Russia's armed forces with new equipment. So whatever they're doing now, it's safe to assume they're only going to get better at doing it. Therefore, we should view the Russia threat as long-term, high risk, and extremely high stakes. U.S. allies, partners, and adversaries alike in the Middle East and Asia are watching how the United States responds to Russia's aggression and violations of international law and will calibrate their actions accordingly. So, how should we address the Russia threat? Well, the Obama administration decided on a policy in spring of 2015 that called for action across 4 lines. First, obviously, defense and deterrence. Second, building the resilience of allies and partners in Eastern Europe. Third was continuing to cooperate with Russia in areas of mutual interest on global challenges. And then fourth, leaving the door open for Russia to one day reintegrate into the international fold. I think this basic approach was right. However, it needs amplification in certain places. I was recently reminded of an insightful observation from Nixon, where he said that the basic rule of Russian behavior was laid down years ago by Lenin. Probe with bayonets. If you encounter steel, withdraw. If you encounter mush, continue. So the Russians acknowledge strength, and we must be strong in our defense of Europe. In general, this means that we need to increase our presence in Europe with more troops, more pre-positioned equipment, and targeted capabilities. The European Reassurance Initiative, or ERI, was a good start. I think it needs to be expanded and codified in the Defense Department's base budget. We should also support Europe's energy independence, reinvest in intelligence, strengthen our air and missile defense, undertake a targeted communications offensive to push back on Russian propaganda, and offer greater security assistance to our partners and allies in Eastern Europe to raise the cost on any Russian action should they try something. Our allies, too, must step up. We cannot be more invested in European security than the Europeans themselves. And finally, I think it's important to note as part of this conversation that we can seek transparency and dialogue alongside strong defense and deterrence. These ideas are not mutually exclusive. And through all of this, we need to be clear about U.S. intentions to avoid the risk of miscalculation, make a distinction between the Russian people and the Putin regime, and just keeping in mind, while Putin's approach may have been somewhat successful in the short term to rally the Russian people around the flag, I think it is ultimately self-defeating. Russia has few allies and fewer friends. Its economy is in decline. GDP went down 4% last year. The IMF is forecasting another 1% in 2016. The ruble continues to weaken against the dollar. The best and the brightest are leaving. So it's a failing philosophy. However, we have no way to predict how long it will take for Putin's adventurism to catch up with him and to compel a change in course. Therefore, I think we need to settle more in for the long term, begin shifting from a surge mentality in Europe to more of a new normal footing. This will not only increase our the credibility of our deterrence, but will also ease the burden on the forces that are out there conducting these assurance and deterrence activities. So that's Russia in a nutshell.
That is actually, you ended on a perfect segue over to Nate, who has to be thinking from sitting where he sits at the Strategic Studies Institute for the Army War College about ground forces and what this whole conversation about what stays the same, what has always been and endured in deterrence, and how it may be changing in its manifestation. Right. What are those implications for the ground forces in the United States?
So I'm gonna start from the I'll start from the gross, and I'll try and work my way down to the granular a little bit. And the advantage of actually being last is that most of the great stuff has already been said. So I'll try and actually be brief in the way in talking about this problem. I mean, it's fortuitous that we're having this discussion at this time because we actually just recently were in the last stages of a pretty major study at the Army War College on gray zone threats. And in looking at the problem, we actually looked at Russia, Iran, and China, and then the wider MENA region as archetypes, really. Not necessarily, we looked at their sort of the characteristics of how they're competing, and then in the case of MENA, how the environment itself is sort of competing against us and our interests. And we came up with some pretty interesting insights. And I think one of the major insights that we came up with first and foremost is the only major actor in this whole game right now that's deterred is us, right?
That's how you know deterrence still matters.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, that frankly was not, I don't think it was alarming or surprising, but it was clearly, it clearly stood out that there's clearly a group of competitors out there that are being very activist against us and actually achieving some objectives that are contrary to our own, and they're doing it pretty effectively. And in response, we are not quite as coherent or activist in response. I mean, I think, the root problem and why this is causing us so much trouble, frankly, Bob referenced it, Mike referenced it, Lisa also referenced it as well. I mean, the root problem is we have an inherently conservative approach about the employment, to a certain extent, about the employment of our power, although there was a major sort of caveat to that in the last 15 years. We have a conservative approach to the use of our power because we've always had the benefit of advantage, right? At least since the end of the Cold War, we've always sort of had time, and technical advantage over adversaries, and therefore as a result of that, we haven't had to deal with it. What we're faced now is we're faced with a wholly different sort of model of competition against the United States. It isn't quite as symmetrical, right? And what we found is it has three characteristics. It is hybrid to a large degree, and really I think the best way to describe the hybrid nature of it is using Mike's construction of the matrix, right? It ticks all the boxes, and we only tick a couple at a time, and when we do it one at a time, right? So that's one characteristic of this problem. The second is it really does present, and I'm actually prone to hyperbole, so do excuse me, but it really does present a direct universal menace to the way we like to do business, right? It just does not, we kind of, in the security realm anyway, like things to be a little more ordered and a little more structured and a little more sequential and linear than, frankly, this problem is presenting itself. And then finally, it's risk confused. And I think this was the best discussion, pre-conference discussion I had downstairs as we talked about this concept of risk confusion, right? Where to US policymakers, the hazard associated with action and inaction with respect to this problem looks equally high and unpalatable, right? So, but the difference is inaction, the hazard's deferred. So with action, if you provoke one of these competitors, you may find yourself in a nuclear war, or at least that's the going in proposition, right? With the Russians, if I provoke them too much, well, we might cross some red line that in the end brings down their entire, scary nuclear arsenal. And so for U.S. policymakers, there's this real dilemma. At the same time that we have this difficulty with action and inaction, there's also an asymmetry of risk perception between the two parties, right? So we have this dilemma, we're fixed, we're paralyzed on the risk problem. For their part, they're willing to probe. It's the bayonet, I love it, right? Like the thing is I get to borrow a riff off of everybody, but it's the bayonet analogy that they get to probe. They get to, because our perception is that any toe inside that uncertain area between sort of war and peace, any provocation in there that we take is gonna suddenly spiral out of control and we're gonna end up at war. Whereas the competitor's perception is that I'm gonna continue to probe until I run into steel, right? And I think that that's a very good sort of model as to the way to look at this problem. So look, I don't want to spend too much time here. So let me just talk about kind of some of the major findings we came to from a defense and ground forces perspective with respect to this problem. So let me first talk about what we found in general, the macro findings. First, Mike said it. There isn't a grand strategy, right? So that to me is, in many respects, that's the most academic argument there is. There isn't, and there probably won't be, so we're gonna have to get over it. We're gonna have to just think about it conceptually and strategically. You're never gonna get a list of grand strategic actions that the country's gonna take, but you can get a vision and you can understand where you wanna go vis-a-vis these problems. So we don't have a grand strategic perspective on the problem. I talked about the asymmetry in risk perceptions, and then to get to one of Mike's particular problems, or issues, I think was useful, and actually Bob talked about it as well. Combatant commanders, the responsibilities, the authorities and responsibilities of the combatant commanders to actually sort of operate against this problem are out of balance. We actually basically look at them and we say, look, anything in your region is your problem, but we actually don't give them the freedom of action to purposefully operate against this particular issue. And actually, we found in looking at the problem with the Russians in the Cold War, for example, the Soviets in the Cold War, we persistently operated against the Soviets in the Cold War, and we never went to war, right? And by and large, we underwrote deterrence as a result of that. So that we found. Look, if you look at our phasing model that we love the linear constructions. The phasing model is, as you understand, are 5 phases of military operations that the joint community is enamored with. And to be fair, there is work ongoing that's looking at this. So I'm not, attempting to arbitrarily knock the joint community on this because they are looking at this. But our linear 5 phases of joint operations doesn't fit. They're in they, meaning the competitors, are in many instances in their own dominate phase, and we happen to be in 0 or 1 or whatever arbitrary number of phase we actually assign to it. So they're operating, we're not operating is another example of that. And then how our concepts and our design for the operational employment or use of force and forces does not actually fit this form of competition either. So what do we do in response? The first thing, and frankly, we heard this from NATO when we started our project, going around talking to folks about this gray zone. We heard this from representatives in NATO. There's no compelling common perspective on this problem, right? Like, it's very easy for policymakers at the highest level to either by omission or commission to not connect the dots and say that there's a campaign going on against us, right? You can actually take isolated incidents and say, oh, well, I think you actually, Mike, you laid that out, right? Like, there's always, we'll accept the perception we want to accept of the activity that's going on. But really, we do need to sort of, in particular specific instances, with respect to the Russians, with respect to China, Iran, et cetera, we do need to actually develop sort of a common understanding of the problem and how to address it. Then we suggest that DoD needs to lead up. This is actually a Plan Orange kind of concept, right? But if there isn't going to be a grand design, if we're going to constantly fight amongst ourselves, sort of at the national political level about sort of what the best way to approach this problem is, we suggest that DoD should lead up in this regard, right? Think deeply about the problem, think about it in all its dimensions, not actually charter action without the authority given to them by the national command authorities, but really be sort of a leader as it applies to this form of competition, and start thinking through the constructive activity that you can use to operate against it. We need to empower the combatant commanders more with respect to this. If we're gonna in fact be more activist and take a more campaign-like approach to counter this and to actually deter activity through activism, then we need to empower the combatant commanders to be able to do that. And then finally, we need to develop some new and more adaptable concepts and capabilities, organizational structures and that's what I'm going to close with to deal with this. So let me make 4 final points on what specifically the ground forces might think about having said all of that, right? The first thing is ruthless multifunctional modularity. That's a lot of words, but let me tell you what I mean by that.
I like the ruthless part.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
not a normal bureaucratic term.
We largely corporately are enamored with fixed organizations and fixed structures. And we like to say that we mission tailor forces for missions, but we are not particularly, I don't necessarily know if we actually walk the walk in that regard, right? So, and really what this stems from is, look, if you got a hybrid problem, you better bring a hybrid solution to it, right? Don't necessarily approach a hybrid problem with a very conventional solution. So what forces would look like, for example, in Eastern Europe to deal with the Russian problem are probably very different than what ground force composition would look like in an operational sense in the Western Pacific. And we have to actually become comfortable with odd combinations of forces operating together: air defense, logistics, ISR, right, force protection, maneuver forces, et cetera, in what we would call odd combinations, right? So ruthless modularity. And then alongside that, be much more comfortable with distributed operations, right? You're not gonna operate in mass, there's not gonna be enough of you. You're gonna have to be much more comfortable operating with relatively unsecure lines of communication between units on the ground and organizations operating against this threat. So find ways to cover the dead space with the ISR, empower leaders to actually operate effectively against it, and get used to being more distributed. This is an old label, this next one, but it's very important. Soft GPF integration is going to be increasingly important. The soft world has done a lot of work on the gray zone, but it's their interpretation of the gray zone. It's not the one, it's not the corporate view of the gray zone that the Pentagon necessarily has. And so what we really do think is that, look, special operations forces and general purpose forces are going to need to operate side by side, and they are both going to have to be comfortable at times with one being in control of the other. And so that means at times soft forces control general purpose forces, and at times general purpose forces exercise command and control over soft forces. Soft is a great force multiplier. There's not enough of them. Many of the missions that we need to perform are GPF missions, but there's a clear soft component to it. So that soft GPF integration will become very important. The third one is reimagined expeditionary operations, right? We have a concept right now. The ground forces have a concept, what they mean by expeditionary. If you go back to my point 1, ruthless modularity, right, we need to reimagine what we mean by expeditionary. Sometimes expeditionary operations are enabling a partner, they're enabling other joint forces, right? They're enabling the interagency. Sometimes our expeditionary operation is to build the resilience and capability. Not just enabling means sort of provide a foundation. Building capacity is actually creating capability in a partner. So build a foundation of partner capability. Sometimes expeditionary operations will be focused on unconventional warfare in the special operations sense and counter unconventional warfare, right? There's a different way to defend against little green men, for example, than there is defending against a guard's tank army that's going to roll across a boundary, and you have to be prepared to conduct those kinds of operations, counterpartisan sort of activities. And then finally, and then distributed, I talked about distributed operations, but much more distributed offensive and defensive operations with the conventional forces, right? Learn to be more self-sufficient, operate sort of independent of higher headquarters, and be able to execute missions successfully as a result. And then finally, let me add with the last one. This concept of offensive and defensive UW is like probably the one Cold War skill that really atrophied at the end of the Cold War. This idea that we were going to raise, violent internal problems to an adversary to counter their similar activity. In the same way we're talking about, for example, training right now the Syrian opposition forces and people like that, but actually presenting that kind of threat to an adversary, that you have the capability to do this, and you're more than willing to actually fight fire with fire to a certain extent with unconventional forces is certainly cause for pause amongst some that might contend with you in pursuing that angle themselves. So with that, I'll leave it.
Great. Okay. Well, that is a very rich set of issues to pick on. Let me take a broad one to start, which is the role of alliances. It's a little bit of a softball, perhaps, in this crowd. I think everybody's ready to hit that one pretty hard. But obviously, in this country right now, we have a roiling debate from the Atlantic article in which the president was quoted speaking about free riders and other sundry things to say about allies, to, of course, Donald Trump's statements on allies. And presumably beneath that, a real public concern, a long-standing one, frankly, about the investment we make in those allies. When you look at this deterrence issue set in the 21st century, either by learning lessons of the 20th century and or thinking to how those challenges that we see today maybe are different and evolving, what is the appropriate role in the toolkit for allies? Are they important to the toolkit, and if so, in what way? And I'll go ahead and start with Bob Kagan.
Well, I mean, there's a deeper problem that we're facing. I'm going to get to alliances, but the deeper problem is the fact that I don't think Americans know why we should care about anything that happens anywhere in the world that's outside the United States right now, which is kind of the way Americans have thought at other times in the past. And it's a geographical problem in a way, because if you look at the question, even Obama made this calculation, but so would any number of other people. We can't do anything in Ukraine because it means more to the Russians than it means to us, ultimately. Well, it's the nature of being the United States that everything means more to somebody else than it does to us, because we're the last ones that are going to suffer when the world order collapses. We're not the ones who immediately suffer if there's a regional problem. It is only because we decided after World War I and World War II that the overall world order was in our interest, and that is what keeps us out there. But the world order is a very hazy concept, and Americans don't understand it. They haven't had it explained to them in at least 8 years, if not longer. So in the absence of that, you say, so what are we doing supporting all these allies? So the fact that allies are free riders is an inescapable phenomenon of what we have been doing since World War II. We were the ones who decided that it was in our enlightened interest that Japan be protected, that Western Europe be protected, and now that Europe is protected. All those things serve our interests, and we are the main protector of it. And so it is inherent in the system that there is a certain amount of free riding going on. Now, it's not fair. Japan spends a tremendous amount of money on its defense. Our European allies do have defense capabilities. They're not what we want them to be. It's not true that it's a free ride, but it is inherent in the system. We don't want these countries, whether it was Germany or Japan or what have you, to become so strong that, in a sense, we're back to a multipolar system, which in my view is a more unstable system. So the real question is, are we still credible defenders of that order? Yes, we want the Japanese to be able to do what they're doing, and they are. Yes, we want the Europeans to spend more, but the real question comes back to us. And again, unless you feel that this overall world order is in our interest, then it's impossible to understand why we have any of these relationships. And that's the part that's missing. That's what's under attack by Donald Trump, by Bernie Sanders, and by Barack Obama, even, if you take what he says in the Atlantic seriously. And I'm sure they speak for the majority of Americans right now. And that is, I mean, we're having this nice conversation about what we have to do and how we have to beef up and do all this other kind of stuff. But before we could get to any of this stuff, you ultimately have to convince the American people that any of this is worth doing.
Alliances and deterrence.
I think I talked about it a lot.
No, that was great.
good.
You-
I may have forgotten to talk about
I
it.
think you teed it right up. For,
I think
for Mike and Lisa.
I think sometimes when we think about counter-coercion in the Western Pacific or in Central Europe, we focus on the other guy's objectives, say in the Crimea or in features in the South China Sea. And maybe we should consider that the actual strategic objective in a Clausewitzian sense is our alliance systems themselves. I'll defer to Lisa on Russia, but I know that's the case in Asia. The San Francisco Treaty System that set up our bilateral alliances is really the sort of Clausewitzian center of gravity,
right.
that is being targeted, but it's also one of our great strengths. And ultimately why I think we can be a little more relaxed. We don't have to panic in the longer term if we can get our act together, big if. It's not just allies, it's allies and partners. So how do you go at the center of gravity if you're in the Western Pacific? Well, you can make a run at Japan, but Abe stood up in the East China Sea and we stood with him, and the president reiterated that Article 5 of our security treaty applies. Abe went toe-to-toe or keel-to-keel, and it sort of reached an impasse for now. The PLA, Navy, and Coast Guard are deploying a lot more stuff. For now, reached an impasse. It's moved down the island chain. What do you do about the Philippines? Well, you know, Article 5, our security commitment to the Philippines in the treaty is a lot more ambiguous. Soft spot, test and demonstrate there, or Vietnam, where we're not allies at all, and defense cooperation is really obstructed by democracy and human rights issues that are legitimate. So, you know, it's a cliche in the Asia world, I hate to say it, but you kill the chicken to scare the monkey. This is a problem for us. And if Japan, which has an ironclad security guarantee, or Korea, panicked when President Obama went back on the Syria red line, imagine their reaction in the Philippines, where we have a security treaty, but it's a little ambiguous. So the other side, the Chinese, and I don't want to portray the Chinese as demons. This is complicated. We actually have a stake in China's success. We need to work together. Right. But we need to draw some lines clearly. So the other side is focusing on this sort of, you know, problem that we have. They're playing on the classic alliance dilemma that Thucydides identified. You know, allies are afraid of entrapment and abandonment. So they're playing on the Asian allies' fear of abandonment. And we play into it sometimes. When we announced, or not announced, when the administration embraced Xi Jinping's vision of what's called a new model of great power relations between Japan and China, it sounded like a bunch of Chinese characters. What harm could it do? U.S. and China, you know, working together. Well, the Chinese description of that in the region is the U.S. and China are great powers, and Japan, India, Australia, Indonesia are middle powers. So it's a bipolar condominium. It's a different construct that's that every ally noticed. So play on the fears of abandonment by our allies, so you can coerce them more. Play on American fears of entrapment. You're going to let the Philippines, and if you read the Chinese official line, you're going to let the Philippines or Abe Shinzo, this right-wing crazy guy, get you in a war with China. So they're playing all of those as well. I think our counter, people talk a lot about cost imposition, but that in a way sounds very tactical. I think we need to think about it strategically. Our counter is that Beijing's assumption is that our alliance system will wither over time because of the dialectic forces of history and trade and integration around China. And I think we need to break that assumption. So that means making our bilateral alliances more joint and combined. Only in Asia, only US, Korea is joint and combined. With the defense guidelines review, changes in the Constitution, Japan's moving in that direction. We're moving kind of in that direction with Australia in some respects. But also make these separate hub and spokes bilateral alliances start coming together, and they are, even without us pushing. Japan, Australia, Japan, India. Japanese and Koreans drive each other nuts. We put a floor under that, and maybe they'll start working together more. And then we need to demonstrate, that we're not afraid of entrapment. So the answer to entrapment for the U.S. is not stand back. We're not going to give the Philippines or any of these countries a green light. That's not the answer. You stand back, and then you lose control of deterrence and escalation by your ally.
Right.
So the answer is you got to be more joint and combined, which is not where this town was 2 years ago on Asia. I think it's starting to come together. And then the last thing is that one of the ways that the Chinese, and I think the Russians, will demonstrate the abandonment fear is to constantly calibrate so as to avoid conflict with the U.S., but demonstrate that their risk tolerance is higher than ours. And I think both Russia and China have very successfully done that. And as long as our allies and partners see that we have a lower risk tolerance for the reasons you described, I think we have a problem. And the answer is not to be unpredictable, by the way. But that's sort of a problem we got to solve.
Lisa, thoughts on this?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, I mean, it's well known, the only thing worse than having allies is not having allies. And NATO is notoriously hard to work within. You know, everybody comes with their own set of interests to the table, and it's a consensus-based organization. And, you know, depending on how you want to look at it, that could be seen as an advantage for the Russians. You know, they get to make decisions based on the impulses of a single decider, and NATO has to sit around the table and make decisions at 28. So, you know, one of the things I mentioned in my opening remarks is that the hybrid challenge is partly so challenging because it confuses and delays traditional Western decision making. You're not going to see tanks rolling across the border in Narva. I mean, you might, but far more likely that that won't be the case. It'll be something like a disputed election that leads to domestic violence, that Russia goes in under the compatriots policy and tries to put it down, and you know, using our own mechanisms of democracy against us in a certain way. That's something that I don't think NATO has its hands around. Nate mentioned that there is no common idea of what happens in those kind of scenarios, and I think the war games that have been played to date sort of show that there's no good option. You know, what constitutes Article 5 is sort of the big question that, as we look at hybrid, as we look at Russia, we're going to continue to struggle with, I think. Do allies need to do more? Yes, of course they need to do more, but it doesn't mean you back out. It means you put your heads together and get the hard work done. So.
And you have once again perfectly set up my question for Nate, which
Great.
is you did a great job of outlining some ideas on how ground forces ought to reconceptualize their contribution to these challenges, these hybrid gray area counter-provocation issues. But much of the challenge set is going to come at us in ways that military forces are not, at least primarily in some of those cases, the main component. So have you also given thought to how that military component, I understand you looked only at ground forces, but indulge me, how
No, we looked at the whole, we did look at the
Great,
whole
how
thing,
the
yeah.
military, even at a combined level, intersects with other tools, and how well we're doing that, what we need to learn to do it better in areas like economic coercion, you know, political warfare, quite frankly, which is happening in both of these cases, and we haven't talked much about Iran, but I think you can make a case for Iran as well. So
interestingly enough, we reference political warfare as a competency that probably needs to be raised in our response. I think that we chartered the effort that when we worked on this effort, we were a bit skeptical about. I mean, essentially start every report on a subject like this with, the interagency has to be more integrated and involved in
whole
this.
of government.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think that's precisely why we arrived at the conclusion that DoD needs to lead up, right? Like, needs to basically say, this is a problem, this is what it looks like, it has many dimensions to it. We can do only so much, and then these are the vulnerabilities that are exposed as a result of not rolling in sort of economic aspects to it, et cetera. I mean, one of the interesting perspectives we got from a relatively senior leader out on the road when we were talking about this is how each provocation is sometimes treated in isolation, like it's the first and the last time you're ever going to see it.
Right.
And so the solution to the problem is a whiteboard solution. It's not a playbook solution, right? So in reality, you should be able to go call a play, and instead you face this and you go to the whiteboard and you design a play on the spot, right?
You should probably explain you're a football coach.
Yeah, well, that's yeah. So the point is, I think that one of these, the specific solution is first to get a common understanding, and then to basically, with that common understanding, sit down and say, look, we cannot be reactive anymore, and so we have to set conditions against this challenge and compete and operate against this challenge with as many different components, with as big a matrix as the other guy has. And if we don't do that, we're going to persistently be left behind.
But can I just say, I mean, all that is absolutely true, but the prerequisite even to designing tools, much less using tools, is that you are willing to take the risk of,
Yep.
You put it very well. Our competitors are happily operating in this gray zone, and we don't even want to step into the gray zone because the risk seems to be too high. So for instance, the Russians decide they're going to put planes up in the air in Syria. We could have said, no, you're not, and we could have put our planes up. Would we have risked the possibility of a crash or something happening? Yes, that would have been the necessary risk. In my view, the Russians would have backed down. Throughout the Cold War, we took those kinds of risks all the time. When Harry Truman did the Berlin airlift, the Russians had a million choices about how they could have stopped that. He took a risk. They decided it wasn't worth, because the overall power ratios were such that they didn't want to have a war with us. I'm convinced it's still the case that Vladimir Putin doesn't want to have a war with NATO. But we are acting like the risk is too great for us, so therefore we won't even play. You could have said, after the Russians invaded Ukraine, we could have armed the Ukrainians. That would have been one tool in the toolbox. Why didn't we? Because we were afraid of escalation. So if we're always going to be afraid of the next escalation, then we're done in that gray area. So all these things you're saying need to be true, but the first step we would have to say is yes, and this is going to be true in the South China Sea. We're going to have to be willing, at least, to have a potential conflict with China over rocks in the South China Sea. That's the nature of the situation we're in. There's no escaping it, because for all the reasons that Mike said. But could you sell that to the American people right now? So if we could get the consensus that yes, we have to play in these areas, we'd figure out the tools to play in them.
Great. And Mike, you wanted to add
So
something?
I just finished a book, little pre-Christmas advertising on the history of U.S. strategy in Asia, and as Bob knows, it's the best time because you're done, but you still remember all the facts.
Right. Give it a couple of years.
Yeah, I know. I'll forget these in about 6 months. So on Nate's point, in the interwar years, the Navy Board in particular, but the Army-Navy joint planning process on War Plan Orange, they frequently decided this is a bigger problem set than we can solve with military instruments, and they wanted to go to state. And they were told by the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of War, no, stay in your lane. When I was in the NSC, we had a problem set like this. Treasury, State, everyone was going different directions. I was in the NSC. It was my fault. I was trying to pull them all together. Finally, the Joint Staff came and said, we're offering options to the chairman, and almost everyone says there's got to be a national strategy. So what we did, and I think it applies in this case, is rather than create a sort of detailed playbook, which is optimal, what we did initially was create a matrix. And we had a team that the NSC created, that the National Security Advisor had the principles approved. We had Treasury, USTR, Joint Staff, PACOM, of course, State NSC, and an Intel presence. And every other week we had a matrix. And we get together and we look at every category of, in this case, coercion, and then our toolkit. And all we did was update the matrix and then go back and brief our principals. And this was on Taiwan, basically, but it made a huge difference. Because at least we were looking at the same map of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, grand strategy after writing this book, I've decided is pretty darn hard. But creating the same METI, as the Army likes to say, the same map of what we're dealing with, would go a long way toward solving this problem.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have a mic that will come around when I call on you. Give us your name, please, and your affiliation if you have one. So I have one, I think, right up front here.
Peter Scharfman, MITRE Corporation. This is a question. It's not going to sound like it for the first minute, but I promise by 90 seconds it will be a question. We had a grand strategy, I believe, during the Cold War. The grand strategy was that if we kept the good guys prosperous and united, the bad guys would be afraid to attack overtly and would eventually collapse from within. And in the absence of a new grand strategy, there's a sort of a reflex to continue on that basis. That leads to a question as to what it means to react to probes. One version of reacting to probes is the version that says this is a zero-sum game, and anything that's good for Putin is probably bad for us. And so we need to make sure that nothing important happens that's good for Putin. The other approach is to say it's not a zero-sum game at all, because it's not about the bad guys, it's about the good guys. And what matters is whether Ukraine is able to work its way towards an effective and democratic and halfway honest government. What matters is whether the countries of Asia are able to work together and not jeopardize each other's interests. And therefore, the reactions should be in terms of what will hold the good guys together rather than in terms of what will frustrate the bad guys. And that is a question I'm asking you. Is that in fact a choice, and if so, which way should we be going on it?
Well, I mean, it's obviously true that the more important thing is keeping the good guys healthy. That was the immediate strategy after World War II, that's what the Marshall Plan was all about. But you remember that the Marshall Plan was also undertaken behind a military shield. So let's now flash forward to Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine has its own, if there were no Russia at all, Ukraine would have problems based on its history. However, the continuing, frozen conflict, if you will, in Ukraine makes it infinitely harder for the good guy to get strengthened, because it's done terrible damage to the Ukrainian economy. It's a huge drain. So that you take the already existing problems of Ukraine, and Putin has this ability to turn the heat up, make it more complicated, or turn the heat down if we put pressure on it. So you can't, and in Asia too, I'll let Mike answer it, but in Asia too, you can't judge these good guys in isolation from the challenge that they're facing from China. So the real answer is, it seems to me, you've got to build up the good guys, but behind a shield that protects them as much as possible from those who wish to undermine precisely what we're trying to achieve. That's what we did during the Cold War, and I hate to be boring, but that would still be a very good strategy today.
Mm-hmm. It would, and in the 50s, the Eisenhower administration came up with a full toolkit to deal with these problems, which included public diplomacy, trade. And that was right, and so that's what we should do. The difference, of course, is we never traded more than 1% of our trade with the Soviet Union, and we're up to 16% of our trade with China. So there's another piece, which is we have to have, as every president has since Nixon, a way to work with China and to sort of reassurance, not in a tactical sense, but set a goal that is not zero-sum. So you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. That we can do. I don't, in the Asia world, people are saying, the bet was that China would change before China could change the world. We're wrong, a lot of people say. I don't think so. I think we're looking at 5-10 years of pretty tough Chinese foreign policy and domestic policy under Xi Jinping, but this system in China is not for the ages, and I assume the same is for Putin. So it's not unlike Kennan's thinking in that we need to play for the long haul and protect what's ours. The big difference with the Soviet Union is we want China, and I assume Russia, to evolve as societies, to have links, to have exchanges with us, to work on areas where we agree, and not slip into a zero-sum game if we can help it.
Hi, Mark Buckman from the National War College. I'd be curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the relevance and role of nuclear weapons for deterrence in the 21st century.
Well, just quickly, that gets to the point, I don't know who made the point, we're the ones who are deterred. I don't know that our competitors are deterred, in fact. I don't think that they look and say, if China does something in South China Sea, we're going to launch nuclear weapons, or we're going to escalate to the point of nuclear weapons. But we, on move one, are already thinking about nuclear weapons.
That's exactly.
In my view, we are more likely to see sub-nuclear major power conflicts that are conducted conventionally than we are to see a nuclear war. And that is something that I'm afraid our political scientists and IR theorists, there is this idea of the nuclear peace. I think the nuclear peace is a myth. I think the peace has been kept by overwhelming American predominance across all elements of power. We can have a conflict, a conventional war that does not reach the nuclear level.
So let me turn over to Lisa, because I think this gets most challenging with Russia's new generation warfare concept, its version of A2AD, and the role of nuclear weapons in that, and I think linking that to, I believe it was Bob who started us off on a very important concept on miscalculation and where that exactly all leads. So in addition to sort of strategic nuclear, I would at least contend that there is sort of, has been an ability to prevent a truly existential nuclear exchange, and I do think our nuclear deterrent plays a part in that. There is now, though, this issue of how that escalation ladder that we understood in one way may be changing or not.
Yeah, so the new generation warfare doctrine that Russia came out with does include an element or right to first strike or right to first use. And this is based on a concept of escalate to de-escalate. So in using nuclear weapons, that's how you preclude the large-scale conventional force-on-force combat. The alliance, the NATO alliance, I think, has been a little more reticent in their willingness to fall back on nuclear deterrence. This is for a lot of, one, there's only 3 allies who are nuclear powers, and France will count that as sort of a half because they don't actually integrate their nuclear under the NATO umbrella, so maybe 2.5. But NATO has not been willing to sort of put forward that nuclear element of our doctrine as openly as Russia has. I think there might be a slight shift we'll see what they come out with for the Warsaw Summit, but I know a lot of the Eastern allies would like us to do a little bit more, if not saber rattling, than hearkening back to the fact that NATO is a nuclear alliance. And we will defend every inch of NATO territory if it comes to it. But that's a debate that's happening openly within the alliance right now, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what they end up getting in the Warsaw communique on nuclear weapons. But there's also, since the arms control regimes have come into place, New START treaties and other things, that's been an area where we have been able to find cooperation and links with Russia in the past. So I don't think there's anything that necessarily precludes future cooperation on another New START in the future. I don't think it's where we're going to be right now. But it's an area that I think could evolve over time. We'll just have to watch it.
Part of our live streaming audience includes folks up at the Army War College sitting in classrooms or perhaps some in more relaxed environments, but we have some questions that have come in from them. And Russia definitely seems to be on their minds. So I'm going to try to pull some of these questions together into sort of one thought. And maybe if we start with Lisa, one of the questions is, are there examples that you can call to mind where Russia has been deterred, where there's a sense that we can point to as a success story of, obviously it's hard to prove the negative, but can you point to cases where action seems to have slowed or stopped Russian action? And I'm going to tie into that, and then I'm going to open this up. Related to that, this issue overall of carrots and sticks, what constitutes deterrence and what constitutes sort of, are you in the World War II model or the World War I model, the traditionally thought of World War I model question? Where do we miscalculate into war, and where are we deterring? And so the question was asked with respect to Russia, but I think it's really a general, each actor is different, but a generalized question. So maybe if we start, Lisa, with you on this issue of deterring Russia, and if we've seen what works before, and then open up more broadly to the question of brinksmanship and how to avoid it.
Yeah, so like many things with Russia, there's not a clear answer, but I think if you only have to look back to Ukraine. I think Russia wanted more of Ukraine. They would have loved to connect eastern Ukraine to Crimea, have gone into Debaltseve, but after the first few months, Ukraine deployed. It was the biggest military mobilization on the European continent since World War II. It stopped that advance. And then the Europeans, the United States came in with sanctions. So I think that was an example of deterrence working. Now, it still resulted in a frozen conflict. However, this is why there's no clear yes or no answer, but I think that was an example of where we did apply costs to Russia for its actions. It didn't get everything it wanted. It got some of what we wanted. We got some of what we wanted, and now we're sort of at loggerheads. But I think it shows and provides a useful model for what may be necessary to deter Russia going forward. We are in the midst of a study right now looking at U.S. Army force posture on the European continent. And not only did we go back into Army doctrine, we went back to the Ukraine example. And what were the force ratios that actually did result in Russia changing its calculus? What we found was about, if you can match Russian forces at about a 1 to 3 ratio, then you can have a reasonable chance of increasing the costs. You can't win the war, but you can increase the costs high enough to create a reaction from the Russians. So we extrapolated from that model and basically said, okay, well, if Russia has the ability to rapidly mobilize about 40 BTGs, which is their brigade combat team equivalent, they're a little smaller, but more or less equivalent in capability. So if they can do 40, well, then the alliance in Europe has to be able to quickly surge up to 13. Again, that's not what you need to win the war with Russia. That is what it might take to change their calculus. So we are working on recommendations and models that may be able to get the alliance to a place where when the balloon goes up, we could quickly mobilize 13 BCTs onto the continent. And on this, I'll just note that the United States, should it get the next version of ERI approved, the FY17 recommendation for the European Reassurance Initiative, approved, we would be up to 3 U.S. BCTs on the European continent, more or less at all times. One of those is rotational, but it's heel to toe. So,
yeah, I think that one of the things that's, look, I mean, the thing that's become clear to me just actually in the conclusion of our work and thinking about it since then, right, is that you have, you can deter by punishment and you can deter by denial, right? And the threat of punishment right now does not, because of the way all of these are unfolding, I mean, we are not going to dislodge, for example, the Chinese in a great naval battle in the South China Sea. And certainly in Ukraine, the same applies because of the way that conflict unfolds. You're not going to then sort of take this symmetrical approach where you fall in on the problem and basically kick them out. So thinking forward, and very similar to what you were saying, Lisa, I mean, I think we got to think about how is it that we actually make the problem look too big and too costly for them, right? And it's not just troops on the border. It's actually, how can we, I mean, the reason that Russia, for example, is preying on some of these countries is because they're vulnerable. So how do you actually focus on increasing their resilience enabled by you in order to make the problem look too big for the Russians? And I don't know if we actually are thinking that through. I think we're applying, we're taking a very symmetrical approach in the way we're thinking about deterring or responding to this problem. And I'm not sure that in the long run that's gonna serve us well.
Just to keep beating on this dead horse, the only way you can do that is if you show that you're willing to get bloody, because then they can make the calculation, and this is why you can deter with fewer troops than they have. They have to contemplate, okay, if we get it with the United States, then we have to deal with the whole United States, this huge economic power, their ability to surge militarily, the Europeans on their side. That's what they have to ultimately think about, but unless you're willing to say to them that you're willing to get in it with them, then all that big power doesn't deter. And you can have crazy people like the Japanese who knew they were going to lose, when they began World War II, but for reasons of honor and all kinds of things, who knows, complicated things, they went in it on the maybe 1 in 100 chance that maybe the Americans would just back off.
They thought the Germans were going to win.
Well,
That was their...
but Yamamoto said, I'm going to run wild for 6 months and then I'm dead.
He knew.
So he knew he was going to lose. But anyway, but the key thing is, again, we've got to be willing to stick our nose in, because then the rest of they know the rest of the body can follow.
Okay, and then that second question was the deter, provoke, the age-old, what's deterring, what's provoking. Anyone have anything insightful they'd like to add on that?
The only thing I'll add on that is this has been part of the debate, very much so in the European context since Ukraine. What is deterring? What is provoking? I was recently on a trip where we went through all 6 of the Allied Eastern Flank countries, beginning in Romania, ending in the Baltic states, and we got. The reaction of those countries to this question, it's sort of confounding for them because they see it, one, as a futile effort. You can't not provoke Russia because they're going to cry foul no matter what you do. 2, they see it as a sovereignty issue. If the Russians are allowed to do what they want to do on their side of the border, then why are allies not allowed to do what they want to do on their side of the border? And 3, there's the argument that we kept hearing, which is that it's actually the failure to make yourself a hard target that is the more provocative thing because it invites Russian aggression. So whether or not this is a debate that is more central and localized to DC or to Western Europe, I think it's fair to say, and completely confounding and confusing to the Eastern allies who just say, why are you guys so concerned about this? Is it valid? I think it's always valid, and whenever you're thinking through options, you always want to think through consequences and second and third order effect. That's fair. Have we overemphasized our willingness to accept risk? I think so. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
Just pivoting back to Asia briefly.
We rebalanced.
We've rebalanced away from Asia. What am I going to do? Look, Beijing and the PLA in particular does not want to take on the 7th Fleet, and does not want to take on the U.S. And they talk about decades, 15, 20, 30 years. This is not their time of maximum advantage. And I suspect people worry about a clash or collision. I think it would be, to use a historical analogy, a little like the Panay incident, when the Japanese accidentally strafed an American ship in the 30s and they backed way off because they were not ready. They were dealing with the Soviets.
That was no
and
accident.
so forth. Well, it wasn't an accident. They said it was.
Big flag on the...
And I don't think in the debate in the administration, I don't get the sense that people on the China case worry about a provocation that would lead to war. They worry about the wrong thing. They worry that we'll provoke China and they won't cooperate with us on climate change, or North Korea, which is completely backwards.
Please tell me
if you
that's
want
not
China to cooperate with North Korea, you got to show that if they don't, we have the willpower and the alliances to do things on our own and without them. And they won't like it, but we're sorry. And on climate change, there's nothing that Xi Jinping has done on climate change that's not already in China's interests. So that's the problem for the next 5 or 10 years of China. People are thinking about the provocation in the wrong game. It's not the same game, and they've got that wrong. What we have not discussed, which perhaps fits in this gray zone, is North Korea. And North Korea lives in the world of brinksmanship.
Yes.
It lives by brinksmanship. And I don't know if this fits in our coercion, counter-coercion, but if you think of anything below breaking the armistice and triggering, 5027, the North Koreans are doing more now than they did under Kim Jong-il. And the most recent moves suggest, they're evoking Kim Il-sung. They're evoking attacks on the Blue House. And they could do stuff that's sort of the armistice or just up to that line. And what no one's sure of is, do they think their nuclear capability gives them a higher threshold to provoke us? That's a very hard problem. It gets back to nuclear deterrence, the earlier question. And that is also sort of one of these gray zones in a way. And I know General Scaparrotti in the command has dealt with this and has thought about it, but it's going to be a constantly evolving problem.
Can I just add one?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
no, these are going to be your closing comments, by the way, because we've run out of time. So I'm going to go Nate and then Bob.
All right. So here's my quick point. My quick point is, look, that we have to, if we're going to operate against the problem, right? This question of provoking or not provoking, right? One thing we came to that I thought was really interesting is we're going to have to be okay with a little bit of angst in Washington while we begin to operate and routinize operating against the challenge, right? So there's going to be that period where you're going to be a little more activist against these actors, and you're going to be asserting your influence vis-a-vis these actors, and it's going to increase your blood pressure a little bit because your forces are going to be operating in closer proximity to them. But over time, especially, I have to believe, for example, with the Chinese, over time, there's going to be the same kind of convention that emerged with the Soviets at one point, where it all becomes just kind of a routine. We know what the Americans are doing, and it never goes beyond a certain point. But
That's the answer to the provocation, counter-provocation, at least with the Chinese. If it's consistent
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
and predictable, it's manageable.
Yep.
Good. Last word, Bob.
Okay, well, sorry, I prevented people from asking more questions because I talk too much, certainly. But when you're dealing with dissatisfied or rising powers, they're already provoked. They're provoked by the unfair distribution of power and wealth in the international system. So you're never going to get to the point where you're not provoking them. We provoke Russia by our very existence, by the alliances we have. We provoke China in exactly the same way. So your starting point is they're provoked. And then the only question is, how are you going to deal with the fact that they're provoked? And in that case, I am less worried about our brinksmanship than I am about our fear of getting to the brink. Mostly, the other guy is in control of whether they get themselves into this. You know, we think about the Cuban Missile Crisis and they were eyeball to eyeball. Khrushchev was never going to allow that to get to a nuclear war. He pushed as far as he could push, and ultimately, when Kennedy pushed back and also gave away the missiles in Turkey, that was fine. We always think that we're at this situation, but the other guy, and the same is true with Putin. He will push, he's not the one who wants a war with us. So international relations theorists talk about this security dilemma. You don't want to be in a security dilemma. We're in a security dilemma. US competition with China is non-ending, and that's the only part where I would ever conceive of disagreeing with you. We're not going to reach a calm moment. By the way, looking back on the Cold War, there was no periods of calm in the Cold War. Hans Morgenthau I don't quote Hans Morgenthau very often, but Hans Morgenthau famously said the Americans are constantly looking for the moment when the great drama of international great power conflict ends, the curtain comes down and it's all over. And that never happens. It will never happen. Americans would love to go back to sleep, wake us up when it's time to come out again. We can't. We're going to be in tense situations forever. And that's hard to wrap your head around.
Well, I think that's a great ending. And again, I am sorry we didn't have more time for your questions. It was such a broad topic. But please join me in thanking our panelists who were wonderful.